Racism has been called by some the original sin of the United States of America. Racism has pervaded our nation from the time of white settlement of these lands and the violent displacement of Native Americans and the importation of enslaved Africans. Though the founders of our democracy proclaimed that all men were created equal, they counted black men and women as only 3/5 of a person. And it took a civil war to change that wording in our Constitution. A 100 more years, plus God knows how many lynchings and Jim Crow laws and the Ku Klux Klan would be required to enforce school desegregation and the Voting Rights Act and a fair housing law. And yet here we are today, 50 years more from that time, a two-term black president later, and while there are more people of color in entertainment and sports and business than there have ever been, still, in our country, the schools of brown and red and black children are by far more substandard than those of white children. Families of color have a far greater risk of being poor, and individuals of color have twice the chance of being unemployed. While the segregation of races in our country is as great or greater than it's been ever, in fact, do you know when the greatest time of segregation is in our nation? Sadly, it's Sunday morning. Sunday morning. Nationally, we've seen communities like Baltimore and Ferguson and Charlottesville erupt in anger over perceived injustices at the hands of police and the judicial system. And groups like Black Lives Matter come together to try to organize and channel some of that anger, only to spark reactions, counter reactions among white supremacy groups. What are we going to do as a nation? How are we going to be reconciled as a people? The chairman of the recently formed United States Catholic Bishops' Committee on Racism, Bishop George Murray of Youngstown, recently said that American Catholics have shown, quote, a lack of moral consciousness on the issue of race, unquote. He urged bold action by the church to, quote, break the silent complicity with the social evil of racism that has marred the past and continues to mar the present. A lack of moral consciousness. The silent complicity. When we come together, as we do tonight, to reflect on reconciliation, to seek the Lord's mercy, we as a church, we don't often stop and think about racism as one of the sins for which we as a church, we as Christians, need to seek healing. I'm sure most of us, myself included, we don't consider ourselves racists. Perhaps in terms of blatant individual behaviors, none of us would like to be known as racists. And yet racism is oh so subtly institutionalized. Institutionalized in our culture, in our society, and even in our church. We who are white, we hardly recognize the preferential treatment that is embedded in systems like banking and medicine and real estate and education, in employment, in politics, in criminal justice, and sometimes even in our personal behaviors. It's not conscious. It's not deliberate. But it's destructive nonetheless. Let me give you an example. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey recently spoke at a hearing at a nomination of a federal judge. He said, quote, "You're aware that African Americans are stopped more than whites for drug searches in our country? There's no difference in the use by blacks and whites of drugs or drug dealing. But blacks are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for it. You're aware of the data, I imagine, that says African Americans are more likely to get mandatory minimum sentences for the same crime? And you're probably aware of the data that African Americans are more likely to serve more time for the very same crime? "50 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson established the Kerner Commission to look into why our nation's cities at that time were being destroyed by rioting. And the Kerner Commission identified white racism as the key cause of, quote, pervasive discrimination in employment, education, and housing. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute reviewed in the Washington Post just 2 weeks ago, there has been no progress. No progress in how African Americans fare in comparison to whites when it comes to home ownership, unemployment, and incarceration. And that's over the course of 50 years. We as a nation and as a church have urgent and difficult work to do together. And you know, this isn't the first time that the Christian community has had to undertake racial reconciliation. In fact, racial reconciliation is probably the oldest social problem the church has had to deal with. The big problem facing the early church was a problem between Jews and Gentiles. If you read the Acts of the Apostles or the letters of Paul, you hear about it over and over again. The Jews considered themselves a race apart. Along come Paul and other early Christian preachers who wanted to integrate the Jews and the Gentiles. But the Jews regarded the Gentiles as dogs, as pagans, as heathens. They even brought Jesus into the story, as we heard in the gospel reading tonight. You want me to heal your daughter? You're a Greek, you're a Gentile. We don't throw the food of the children to the dogs, he said. The story of the gospel reflected the conflict of racial reconciliation that the church was trying to deal with. And Paul, writing to the Romans, is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Of course he is. God is one, and he will put the Jews right with himself on the basis of their faith, and he will put the Gentiles right through their faith. We say that we Catholics are open to the truth wherever we will find it. We are Catholic. Surely then, we can be open to hear from our African American and Hispanic brothers and sisters about where racism still pervades and pollutes our society, our institutions, and yes, even our church. Surely we white Catholics can hear without becoming angry and accusatory at those who bring what sometimes is going to be a hard message for us to hear. Surely, we who have made the sacrament of gathering and eating at a table oneness in the name of Christ can overcome any division caused by the color of our skin or our ethnic background. Surely we who have all been reconciled to God in the blood of the Lamb can learn to be reconciled to one another for His sake. Surely